Welcome to Mind Overboard, the channel where we take a deep dive into seemingly simple questions or interesting topics and try to provide an alternative perspective. In this video, we're going to discuss the question of whether or not black people are prone to violence, prompted by comments from this panel discussion. And before we start, I'd like to do a bit of throat clearing here and say this clip is well aged. It's from 2016. It could be that any of the parties that shared their opinions in this discussion no longer hold those opinions. I say this to be fair to anyone represented in the video, but contend that the underlying question is still relevant in our current cultural climate that seems to feed on and propagate a general atmosphere of fear and anxiety. Gun violence is still a primary concern, and if anything, racism and racist ideas have been agitated and emboldened to an even greater degree over the last several years, for some reason. It's an important discussion to have because if we don't occasionally take the time to examine and explain our most important ideals, we run the risk of taking them for granted. The last point of housekeeping is to point out that this discussion revolves around NYPD arrest statistics from 2016. Now, the numbers don't really change in 2017, so any arguments for or against them are still relevant. So what we have here is a conversation about race and police violence in the United States. It was prompted by what was at the time a recent ambush of police officers in Dallas and the subsequent response, which involved claims of systemic racism in the police department. When the discussion drifts toward the general public perception of police, retired Detective Harry Houk takes this opportunity to jump in and put some pressure back on the citizenry.
Now the black community has got to also understand that they have issues that they have to deal with.
He whips out some statistics and asserts that there are issues to be addressed on both sides of the debate. His contention is that while police violence is a worthy topic of discussion, we should also be concerned with what's going on in the black community at large. He cites NYPD statistical reporting on arrest records for a variety of crimes, noting that black people are arrested for a majority of violent crimes and at a rate that's disproportionate to the population. His co-panelist Marc Hill suggests that he's using these statistics to imply that black people may be prone to violence, which Mr. Houk then confirms.
How are you still on national TV and just said that black people are prone to criminality? I wouldn't be able to respond to that, okay?
Well, they are. What does this say?
Criminality.
What does this say?
The main problem with this, in case it's not clear, is that indicating someone or an entire group is prone to something suggests that this behavior is inborn. It's a natural tendency, which can be a disconcerting assertion depending on what kind of behavior we're talking about. The other panelists take issue with this claim, and he does back off of it somewhat. He confirms that prone may not be the correct word. Despite this, he struggles to find a reasonable alternative. I think there's a subliminal reason for this, but we'll come back to that later. And before addressing the question directly, I want to point out that Marc Hill asserts that these statistics are wrong. Mr. Houk counter-argues that the numbers are numbers. They state what's there and represent facts. And while it's true that numbers are indeed numbers, we have to remember that there's a difference in the confidence levels for certain types of statistical analyses. In thinking about how these statistics could be wrong, I came up with some possibilities. And this isn't necessarily exhaustive, but I think it gives a good idea for anyone wondering why someone would disregard a statistical report like this. In this case, the results in question represent an accounting of human behaviors. And human behaviors are a messy, somewhat unpredictable, multifaceted phenomena, and are almost always susceptible to biases and bad information. These factors could impact outcomes for both the alleged criminal and the police officer. Because of this, the report is more akin to a survey result, and surveys require a variety of error-correcting methodologies to prevent bad signals from impacting the results. And even after that, what you're left with is information that may or may not indicate a result worth examining further. It certainly doesn't indicate a cause, which means it, at best, represents a correlation. Now, while we're all familiar with the colloquial wisdom that correlation does not equal causation, we also tend to readily ignore this in situations where the correlation affirms something we already believe or suspect. High correlations are meaningful in situations where there's a high confidence level associated with the results, and there have been accommodations made to account for variables that may taint the results. Even then, the correlation may only confirm that additional testing and research is warranted in order to drive closer toward finding a potential causal relationship. This explains why no one is researching you despite the perfect correlation that exists between your age and the price of oil over time. On top of this, you have the noise introduced by the reporting methodology. Race is defined by the suspect directly by their official identification or by prior arrest records, and in cases where none of this is available, identification is made at the discretion of the officer based on physical characteristics. Now, all of these identification methods have potential complications. To start, aside from the potential to misidentify, is the tendency in general to view anyone of partial black heritage as black. An individual with a white mother and a black father is, genetically speaking, as white as they are black, having received 50% of their genetic code from each parent. Also, because we're dealing with a correlation, the results could just as easily be describing the behavior of the police officers. For instance, the numbers could be identifying populations like types of people police are more inclined to arrest, or neighborhoods police are more likely to patrol. The former is, I think, at least strongly implied by the previous point about race identification. And black or not, in the cases where an officer makes the assessment, they're identifying the type of person they thought they arrested. The other point about neighborhoods is also hinted at by former NYPD Chief Philip Banks.
Our vehicle checkpoints, we did them primarily in African American Latino communities. Is that saying that they drank more?
Connecting this back to the original comment about numbers, while the end result of this study is expressed numerically, there's a significant difference between what's being expressed when you compare the numerical outcome of the report with something like the atomic weight of an electron. When Mr. Houk makes reference to the nature of numbers, he's thinking in terms of immutable or objective outcomes, as though the results represent an indisputable fact about a characteristic of nature. And this is not the case here. These numbers represent an outcome, but don't provide enough information or consideration for variables to assert a cause, primarily because that's not what the report was intended for. So there's a reasonable argument to be made for the numbers being not bad, but insufficient in terms of connecting them to a cause. So that's one issue up front that makes his assessment a non-starter. But we're here to answer a simple question. Let's get to it and ask, if we grant these numbers to not only be true in the context Mr. Houk presents them, but representative of a strong connection between race and crime, is it reasonable to presume the cause is that black people are prone to violence? In order to address this question in a definitive way, I believe we need to take a brief but deep dive into human origins. Now, most experts agree that Homo sapiens have existed for a minimum of 100,000 years. The outer limit of this time frame is harder to ascertain, but not many people go lower than that. And we have a lot of solid evidence that takes us at least that far. And two important points about our history and propagation will provide context for the argument. Homo sapiens originated in and spent most of its early years occupying the continent of Africa. And approximately 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens occupying the northeastern regions of the continent began to migrate into the Middle East and then Asia and areas of southern Europe for any of a variety of reasons. Building off of this basic knowledge, we then have to consider two facts about evolution in early human history. The first, evolutionary changes are typically the result of adaptation to changing local conditions. If your conditions change drastically or a species becomes geographically isolated, mutations that improve the odds of survival may proliferate. In the case of the northern migration, these evolutionary processes resulted in changes to skin pigmentation. Aside from vitamin D production, human skin utilizes energy from the sun for a variety of biological benefits. For any of these benefits, the evolutionary advantage comes from maximizing the positive, nourishing effects of the sun while minimizing exposure to dangerous radiation. The result of this, over a sufficient amount of time, is the development of lighter skin in geographic areas that receive less direct sunlight. It's important to recognize here that there's nothing about the evolutionary process that resulted in varying skin colors that requires us to variegate our species into different subgroups. Our skin color is the result of an impactful but superficial geographic adaptation. It doesn't on its own support the notion of individual races that exist as discrete groups outside of the arbitrary distinctions we make based on our visual acuity. Secondly, in the course of our early history, and possibly acting as an event predicating the previously mentioned exodus, there's evidence that Homo sapiens underwent a severe bottlenecking event of some type. The population was driven to near extinction, potentially reduced to as few as 3 to 10,000 breeding individuals. Despite this, we persevered and proliferated into the dominating global force we are today. An interesting side effect of this is that, despite what we see, we express a significant degree of genetic homogeneity. As genetic testing becomes more readily available and inexpensive, our sample size grows and grows. The exponential addition of genetic samples has only continued to support this assertion. The data is moving in one direction and very strongly. The common analogy is that if humans were dogs, we would all be the same breed. So what conclusions can we draw from this information? Primarily, it shows that while we see a tremendous amount of variety and novelty within our species in terms of small details, all of this variety is a result of a tremendously small amount of actual variation within our genome. We are much more similar than not, and that while skin color is immediately noticeable when we interact with one another, there's nothing about skin color itself that corresponds with more significant underlying differences. Looking back at the original question, we can see that Mr. Houk, in the interest of trying to solve an issue of great concern, came to what can almost certainly be identified as the wrong answer. The data may be meaningful for some things, but it lacks sufficient corroborating evidence to verify Mr. Houk's particular claims, meaning that it would be incorrect to assert that black people are prone to violence. And granted, he did indicate a desire to put some distance between himself and the idea of proneness, but he didn't get very far. Why is that? This is the part that leads to what I referred to in the title as weaponized statistics. To some degree, Mr. Houk likely couldn't come up with a better word because the implication is inherent to the data. The data set identifies two characteristics: crimes for which an individual was arrested and that individual's race. It connects these two factors together, creating the subtle impression that they're causally related, which we've just discovered to be problematic for a variety of reasons. And again, this is not to give the impression that there's no value in the numbers or that they're necessarily negative. Transparency is essential and we need reports like this. Rather, the danger comes in the weight these statistics are granted when individuals with a certain degree of influence or who are in positions of authority or leadership present them in a way that implies a stronger connection than is warranted. When you decide there's a causal connection and then use language like a majority of, or most violent crimes, or 75% of gun violence, it creates a broader impression of inevitability. It gives the general feeling that black people represent danger, and through this, it frames our broader social relationships and puts everyone on edge. It makes an officer nervous about the odds of being shot by a black person while making black people uncertain about whether they'll survive a simple traffic stop. This creates a negative feedback loop that only serves to perpetuate the problem. After all, there are multiple reasonable ways to view these numbers. Approaching it from the opposite direction, there were 998 shooting incidents in 2016, with 656 identified suspects, 70% of whom were black. That's 459 out of a population of close to 2 million, not considering repeat offenders, with 11 incidents involving suspects firing at police officers, since the issue of police violence came up. These numbers, compared to either the population at large or the daily experience of police officers, the NYPD estimates their officers have over 4.4 million interactions with the general public in a given year, and that's based on radio calls alone, and it represents a tiny fraction of a percent. Expressing this in terms that gives weight to the numbers and results in an abundance of pearl clutching gives the exact wrong impression. In reality, the odds are that most of us will go through life without ever being the victim of violent crime or committing violent crime. If you present it in a negative way, paired with the fact that officers have no shortage of crazy anecdotes and experiences involving crime and violence, confirmation bias will immediately legitimize comments like those of Mr. Houk and strengthen one's impression of the potential danger present in routine scenarios. However, of the 43 incidents of aggravated violence directed at officers that year, 42 suspects were apprehended and 41 of them were male. Where's the breathless outcry of the problems being faced within the broader community of men? I have stats right here that show that 95% of violent incidents against police officers are committed by men, so there are obviously problems on both sides here. While I say this sarcastically to prove a point, if we were to take a biological approach to this problem, a focus on masculine violence would actually be more productive than viewing this in racial terms. All of this stems from a premature attempt to use data to identify the cause of a problem, and it was derived from a motivation to find information to support and assert a viewpoint, rather than utilizing evidence to help us modify what we think about how the world works, and leveraging this new perspective in pursuit of viable solutions. We'd be better served by giving the most important and impactful problems we face the due diligence they deserve, and stop relying so heavily on our gut instincts and confirmation biases when attempting to adjudicate complex social issues. In other words, we are obligated to take a more than cursory step when approaching problems that have the potential for disastrous outcomes, and a responsibility to recognize and mitigate aggravating factors that reinforce our biases. Thanks for your consideration. Do you disagree with this? I'd love to hear your viewpoint or argument in the comments below.